In this video, I'll be going over 24 levels of finger control in Osu, from the very basics all the way up to world-class difficulty. For the sake of this video, we'll be defining finger control as the ability to stop and start your fingers to play rhythms accurately and without over-tapping or under-tapping. Of course, there are infinite ways to combine rhythms and make the finger control more complex, but for this list, we'll just be focusing on the core types of patterns, discussing what makes them complex and some tips for playing them. Also, we'll be limiting patterns at 9 notes maximum, at which point the focus becomes a bit less about finger control for that specific pattern. As always, a disclaimer that this is my personal interpretation of this list, but I did consult Twitter and various other platforms while making it. Let's get started. Level 1 is what are called singletaps. These are patterns that just maintain a steady beat and can typically be done with one finger with little issue. While this arguably doesn't require any finger control, it'll help us introduce a really important concept for understanding it: rhythm. Rhythm is an integral part to finger control, since more complex finger control means more complex rhythm, so I'll be explaining how rhythm ties into each of these patterns as we progress through the video. First, let's take a look at the pulse of a song, which is basically just the BPM. This tells us the speed of the metronome, which you can hear by putting your cursor over the Osu cookie in the main menu. This speed can be thought of as 1-1 rhythm. For every one pulse of the metronome, there is one beat. Now, if we speed this up a bit and make it twice as fast, 2 beats for every one pulse of the metronome, it's now described as 1-2 rhythm, and that's what singletaps are. This type of terminology is very common in the Osu community, especially for more complex rhythms, so it's helpful to get familiar with them. Also, 1-2 rhythm is not to be confused with what are known as 1-2 jumps, which are jumps in which all the combos, or numbers on the circles, are just 1s and 2s. However, jumps are typically in 1-2 rhythm, so the terms are very closely associated, but they are still different. As a side note, the maps shown on the screen during each level will be linked in the description, and I would recommend them as practice maps for each of those patterns. But you can use any map you'd like to practice a pattern, with the most important thing just being to find maps that have fun for you. Since single taps are the most simple pattern and can be found in pretty much any map in the game, I'd say to just find any song you like and focus on your accuracy, which will require you to maintain a steady beat that goes along with the song. To find maps that feature mostly single taps with few other types of patterns, pretty much any low 3-star map would work, so again, just find some songs you really like and keep practicing those maps to get the hang of them. The last thing I'll say about single taps is that while you can obviously just play these with one finger, it's equally possible to play them by alternating both fingers back and forth, which is called alternating. This is another integral concept to finger control, so it's important to talk about it as early as level 1. This also introduces the concept of having a dominant finger. If we go back to our definition of finger control, being able to start and stop patterns with either finger, we can see that being comfortable using either finger for a pattern definitely has its benefits, especially as we get into more complex levels of finger control. But that's not to say that having a dominant finger is bad, and I'd actually say that most top players have a dominant finger, even some of the best finger control players in the world, so don't let anyone stop you from having a dominant finger if that's the way you want to play. One of my favorite things about Osu is that it's a very simple premise: move your cursor to each circle and then click them accurately, that allows you to use any playstyle you'd like, and I mean any playstyle. The most important thing is to just find what's comfortable for you and practice over and over and over and over and over, especially in a game like Osu where it's almost entirely mechanics based. So I'd say the best advice is to just tap however makes the most sense to you, as long as it's comfortable. Level 2 is what are known as triples. From a rhythm standpoint, this can be seen as 2 single taps with another note in between, and this introduces a new type of rhythm, 1-4 rhythm. With 1-4 rhythm, we've now divided the pulse again, and now for every one pulse of the metronome, there are 4 beats. Along with 1-2 rhythm, this is one of the most common types of rhythm in the game, and you'll be seeing 1-4 rhythm a lot throughout the rest of this video. Triples are the most simple form of 1-4 rhythm, and they're designed to be played using both fingers. If we had to really break this down, you're basically tapping a 1-2 single tap rhythm twice with one finger, and then in between those taps, you're tapping once with your other finger. This is a very technical breakdown of how to play a triple, and I really don't want you to actually think about this while you're playing. I'm just explaining it so you get an idea of how we can use both fingers to play a pattern, and how both of your fingers work together to play 1-2 and 1-4 rhythms. To understand the rhythm further, let's take a look at these lines that appear in the map's editor. These white ticks show the pulse of the metronome, which we know as 1-1 rhythm. Dividing these in half puts a smaller red tick between each, and the white and red ticks combined represent 1-2 rhythm. We can divide these once more to create blue ticks that represent 1-4 rhythm. For the music aficionados out there, the white ticks represent quarter notes, red ticks are eighth notes, blue ticks are 16th notes, and there are actually these bigger white ticks that represent measures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, you get the idea. In Osu, we tend to use the terms red tick and blue tick since that's what they look like in the game's editor. Let's look at this from the perspective of a single tapper, which, as we discussed, is someone who has a dominant finger and typically plays 1-2 rhythms with the same finger. These players would use their dominant finger for single taps and at the start of each pattern, and their other finger to play notes that are between the 1-2 pulse of that pattern. What this usually looks like is that their dominant finger is used for notes that land on white and red ticks, and their other finger is used if there's anything in between. Even if you single tap and start patterns with the same finger, triples and other rhythms that are faster than 1-2 tend to always require your other finger to be used. Triples are also where we can really start to notice a difference between starting the pattern with different fingers, but we'll talk about this more in a later level. Since triples are so common, it's really important to get comfortable sensing out this rhythm as its own sort of pattern, since it's the building block for lots of other rhythms. Now, with only the first 2 levels of finger control, we can already start to find some higher star maps that feature only single taps, triples, and some sliders. Pretty much every map in the game will have triples at some point, so as always, I would recommend just looking for songs you like and playing those maps to get used to the rhythm of these basic patterns. Level 3 would be triples that end with the start of a slider instead of a circle. This is effectively the same as a triple, just that you need to hold down the last note for a bit longer, but it's important to make this distinction now to help us better understand the next few levels. The slider does slightly increase the difficulty since you have to give yourself enough time to actually hold the slider, which shortens the amount of time between objects compared to if it was just a normal triple. One way to think about these patterns from a rhythm perspective is that the last note of the triple is replaced with a part of a slider, in this case the slider head. While this may not seem different enough to warrant its own level, it's actually pretty important to understand this concept so we can understand the next level. As a side note, some of the patterns I talk about in this video don't actually have proper terms in the community, so I'll be coining my own terms for some of these levels for the sake of discussion. I'll be sure to emphasize if I'm making up my own term for a pattern versus if the name I'm showing is the typical term amongst this community. For this pattern, since the triple features a slider head, the name of the first part of a slider that you click on, I think it's fair to call this pattern a slider head triple. So level 4 is what I'm choosing to call a slider end triple. These expand on the concept we saw with slider head triples, but instead of the last note being replaced by a part of a slider, it's the first note that's being replaced by a part of a slider. You can think of it as a triple where you hold down the first note before playing the next 2, just like how you can think of a slider head triple as a triple where you hold down the last note after playing the first 2. This pattern tends to trip up a lot of players, and a lot of people see this pattern as a slider into a double, which is a pattern we'll get into a bit later, but I think you kind of get the idea. It's just 2 notes instead of 3. But if we take a closer look at the rhythm, it'll be easy to see why I'm choosing to call this pattern a triple. First, let's look at what a normal triple looks like in the editor timeline. The first and last note land on white and red ticks, and the middle note lands on a blue tick, which is what makes this pattern 1-4 rhythm. Now let's compare this to a slider end triple. In both cases, there's a beat on this red tick, but with a slider end triple, that beat is represented by something that's unclickable. Another YouTuber named PishyFat has a great video on rhythm that dives deeper into this concept of representing sounds with slider ends, linked in the description if you want to check it out. The point here is that slider ends do still typically represent a beat in the song, even though they're not a clickable object, so it's safe to say that the rhythm that's trying to be made here is actually a triple. As I mentioned earlier, it can help to think of this pattern as a normal triple where you hold down the first note for a little longer. There's a third pattern we can compare this all to illustrate this a bit more clearly, a single tap followed by a triple. If we listen to the hit sounds of this type of pattern and a slider end triple, we can see that they're almost identical, and for good reason, since they're effectively representing the same rhythm. Also, it's important to note that this slider end triple pattern is often combined with other patterns, such as bursts or streams, as a way to kind of lead into the next pattern. So for this reason, and all the others I've mentioned before, it's helpful to get a solid grasp of what this pattern is actually trying to do. As I've mentioned, many people tap this type of pattern as a slider into a double, and this is actually a commonly debated topic amongst Osu players, so you're welcome to disagree with me here, but the main reasons why I would recommend thinking of these patterns as triples are 1, because the slider end creates a triple rhythmically as we just discussed, 2, because for single tap players, tapping the first circle with the same finger as the slider before it requires you to lift your finger and then put it back down fast enough to not drop the slider end, although full alt players don't actually need to worry about this. And 3, because most people actually find it easier to play triples than doubles, so you might find it easier to think of the pattern this way anyway. Again, if you're someone who always alternates on every note, then this distinction doesn't actually matter to you because the way you'd play it would be the same either way. Level 5 is what I'm choosing to call a slider triple, and it basically just combines a slider end triple with a slider head triple. It's not too uncommon, And if you have both slider end and slider head triples down pretty well, then this type of pattern should actually be pretty easy. One thing to mention, as we discussed in the last level, is to not read this as a slider and then a double, or I guess a slider head double. The reasons are exactly the same, so there isn't much more to get into here. One thing I'd like to add is that it actually is possible for a pattern to look like a slider triple when it actually is a slider into a slider head double. It's important to take note of which tick the pattern lands on. In a slider triple, or a slider end triple for that matter, the slider end lands on a white or red tick, and the circle that follows it lands on a blue tick, which creates the triple rhythm. However, it's possible that a slider ends on a blue tick and then leads directly into another pattern, where a circle starts on the following white tick or red tick. Basically, the distinguishing factor here is really to just check which beat the slider end is on and go from there. For level 6, it's time to look at a pattern that's actually a combination of patterns we've looked at before, a triple that's surrounded by single taps on both sides, which I'll refer to as single, triple, single. We saw a sneak peek of this earlier when we broke down the rhythm of 1-2 and 1-4 patterns, so there isn't too much more to add here. I will say that this is a pretty common form that you'll see triples in, surrounded by single taps, especially in things like long jump sections. Level 7 is a string of 5 notes in 1-4 rhythm, which most people call 5-note bursts and some people call quints. This is one of the most common burst lengths in the game, and as usual, let's take a closer look at the rhythm to get a better understanding of this pattern. So as we've discussed, white ticks represent the metronome, or core pulse of the song, and tend to be the strongest and most prominent beat. First, let's place circles on every white tick to match the metronome. While this is obviously a very basic way of mapping rhythm, it's actually really common for most, if not all, white ticks to be mapped with a clickable object, either a circle or the start of a slider. Now, we also know that white ticks can be split multiple times to create what we know as 1-2 rhythm, 1-4 rhythm, and even more variations that we'll get into later in this video. If we take one of these beats, split it into 4 parts to create 1-4 rhythm, and then place circles in all 4 of those beats, leaving the other beats as they were when we started, we end up creating a 5-note burst, where the first and last beats land on white ticks, and everything between those 2 white ticks is just filled with circles in 1-4 rhythm. Compared to many other burst lengths, 5-note bursts are pretty intuitive to feel out when to start and stop your tapping, since they typically start and stop on strong white ticks. They also end with the same finger you started with, so if you have a dominant finger that you prefer starting and ending patterns on, it makes it very seamless to play this pattern while keeping your dominant finger on the dominant beat. Also, 5-note bursts have the same types of variations that we saw with triples, where the first or last note could be replaced by part of a slider, but as I mentioned at the start of this video, we won't be focusing on every variation of every pattern, just the main core types of patterns from which hundreds of variations could be made. Level 8 is doubles, which are a string of 2 circles in 1-4 rhythm, and not to be confused with 2 single taps stacked on top of each other, which could look similar to a double, but as we've learned by now, is an entirely different pattern with a different rhythm. In 1-4 rhythm, there are 2 main types of doubles. Those that start with a white or red tick and end on a blue tick, or those that start on a blue tick and end on a white or red tick. In other words, doubles always either start or end on a blue tick, which can make the pattern feel slightly awkward or incomplete. But as with any other rhythm, with enough exposure, doubles will start to feel more and more intuitive. From a rhythm perspective, we can almost imagine doubles like triples where either the first or last note was cut off, and it could actually help to think of them this way while you start to get a feel for how to tap doubles accurately, until eventually you start getting comfortable enough to just play them without thinking too hard about it. Also, one common issue with doubles is often just finding maps to practice them on, since not every song's rhythm supports doubles, so they're not nearly as common as some other types of patterns. But as I mentioned, you can find all the maps shown in this video linked in the description. Level 9 is quads, sometimes also called 4-note bursts, which are strings of 4 notes in 1-4 rhythm. These can be compared to 5-note bursts in the same way that doubles can be compared to triples. It's almost like a 5-note burst where either the first or last note got chopped off. As with doubles, it can help to use 5-note bursts as a sort of reference point and pretend you're just ignoring either the first or last beat of the pattern until eventually it starts to click and you can play the pattern without treating it as a variant of something else. Some people also like to think of quads as 2 doubles right next to each other, which can also work as a sort of reference point until you start to get the hang of quads as their own pattern. Level 10, I would say, are consecutive triples, which, as the name implies, are multiple triples placed one after another. Even if one triple by itself is comfortable for you, it's still possible that consecutive triples could cause some issues, since the whole motion of constantly starting and stopping a triple can be pretty tricky at first. Consecutive triples are also a good test of your ability to start and stop patterns with either finger. For the sake of discussion, let's label your tapping fingers 1 and 2. From a finger control perspective, there are 3 main ways to play consecutive triples. 121 121, 212 212, or 121 212. Based on our definition of finger control, a hypothetical perfect finger control player would be able to do all three of these comfortably, but even just being able to do one of them will do the trick for most maps. If the pattern starts to get really fast, it becomes really useful to be able to alternate them, but it's not impossible to build your speed enough to be able to start consecutive triples with the same finger, so don't let me stop you from pushing your single tap speed if that's what's more comfortable for you. Level 11 is 9-note bursts, which are sort of the next step above 5-note bursts. If we look back at how we constructed a 5-note burst by placing circles on every white tick and then filling one beat with 1/4 notes, we can create a 9-note burst in a very similar way by just filling in one more beat with circles. Due to the nature of how 9-note bursts are made, being 2 beats just filled with 1/4 circles, they tend to be more common than 6, 7, or 8-note bursts. On top of that, just like 5-note bursts, 9-note bursts are fairly simple to play since you're typically starting and stopping on a white tick, and also stopping on the same finger you started with. 9-note bursts are pretty common in stream maps, especially lower star ones where they try not to make the streams too long, so you'll start to see them fairly often if you haven't already. Level 12 is 7-note bursts, and it's basically what happens when you take a 9-note burst, and instead of just placing the circles all the way through to the third white tick, you instead place a 1-2 gap before it, or the other way around, where you create a 1-2 gap right after the first white tick. This is often done if the mapper wants to emphasize that white tick a bit more than just having you stream through it, and you also might sometimes see consecutive 7-note bursts, especially in something like a build-up section. While I would personally consider the rhythm of 9-note bursts to be a bit more straightforward, 7-note bursts aren't too much trickier since you're still ending on the same finger you started with. I would say level 13 is 6-note bursts and 8-note bursts, which I would consider similar enough to group in the same level. If we understand how doubles and quads are formed, as we talked about earlier in reference to triples and 5-note bursts, 6 and 8-note bursts aren't too different, but they are definitely less common than most, if not all, other burst lengths, which is why they're the last ones to be mentioned. From my experience, I would say that 6-note bursts are usually a variant of 5-note bursts with an extra note tacked at the front or end, and 8-note bursts are usually a variant of 9-note bursts with a note removed from the front or end. This is usually done for emphasis or to represent something in the song that, for one reason or another, isn't very common in most other songs. But despite not being very common, you definitely will come across these from time to time, and some maps actually have quite a lot of them. So now that we have all burst lengths up to 9, there are a near infinite number of combinations that can be made to make some pretty crazy finger control patterns. The levels beyond this will focus on some common combinations of burst lengths that we've already seen, and then we'll get into rhythms other than 1-2 and 1-4. Level 14 is a single tap followed by 2 doubles, which I'm going to call single double double. Despite maybe seeming a bit random at first, this pattern fits pretty well with what we've learned about 1-2 and 1-4 rhythm. A single double double is the same length as a 7-note burst, meaning that the pattern fits perfectly between white ticks with 1-4 gaps between each pattern. Also, I should mention that variants of this pattern such as double single double or double double single would also fall under the same category. To break down the rhythm of this pattern a bit more, let's look at this pattern from the perspective of a single tapper and listen to only the beats that their dominant finger would land on and compare it to normal 1-2 single taps. First, here are some 1-2 single taps. And here's the first note of each pattern in the single double double rhythm. And while we're at it, let's also look at double single double and double double single in the same way. Here's double single double. And here's double double single. As with any rhythm, it helps a lot to be able to internalize this rhythm and understand exactly what it feels like and what it's trying to do. Level 15, I would say, is a double and quad right next to each other, which I'll shorten to double quad for the sake of discussion, but a quad into a double also falls under the same category. This pattern is rhythmically quite similar to a single double double, and can actually be created by just taking a single double double and adding one extra circle. With that in mind, a double quad is also the same length as a 7-note burst, so just like before, we can put 1-2 gaps between everything and not run into anything too awkward, other than, of course, the double and quad themselves. I would consider quads to be slightly more complex than doubles, which is why this double quad pattern is a higher level than a single double double pattern, but I would say that if you have the rhythm down, then the difficulty of this pattern mostly depends on your comfort with doubles and quads, more so than the rhythm itself. Level 16 I would consider to be doubles and triples combined. I think doubles and triples are sort of the foundation of finger control, since triples are the simplest odd-numbered 1-4 pattern and doubles are the simplest even-numbered 1-4 pattern, but when you put them right next to each other, things start to get pretty complicated. Especially for these later levels of finger control, getting a solid grasp of what the rhythm is trying to do will definitely help a lot with playing these types of patterns, especially because the rhythms themselves that the pattern is based on are usually pretty complex. So at this point, I think we've covered most of the basic patterns that we can make with 1-2 and 1-4 rhythm. Of course, there are already nearly infinite combinations of patterns that could be made with just what we've discussed so far, but to take things to the next level, we're going to have to start introducing more types of rhythms and see how they fit into the grand scheme of what we've learned so far. At level 17, we have a new type of rhythm to introduce, and that's 1-3 rhythm, which a lot of people just refer to as 1/3 or 1/3 patterns. Just like the other types of rhythm we've discussed, the concept is the exact same with 1-3 rhythm. For every one pulse of the metronome, there are 3 beats. While this does follow the same principle that we saw with 1-2 and 1-4 rhythm, 1/3s don't quite line up to the same beat. To illustrate this, let's listen to a constant 1-2 rhythm and then a constant 1-3 rhythm and really try to internalize the rhythm of both. Here's a constant 1-2 rhythm, and here's a constant 1-3 rhythm. Unlike normal single taps and streams, which we can categorize as 1-2 and 1-4 rhythm respectively, 1-3 is kind of like its own parallel universe that has its own version of pretty much everything actually, and we can start going back through all the terms we've learned earlier and just sort of slap 1-3 in front of them. There are 1/3 single taps and 1/3 bursts and streams, 1/3 jumps and 1/3 sections of a map. The vast majority of maps are in 1-4 rhythm, and it's really rare to find a map that's entirely in 1-3 rhythm, but a good amount of maps do have a small section that's in 1-3, even if it's just 1 or 2 beats long. The shortest and most simple form that you'll see 1-3 rhythm in is a 1-3 burst, which is usually 4 notes long and is just one beat filled with circles in 1-3 rhythm. It's the exact same length as a regular 5-note burst in 1-4 rhythm, but instead of 5 notes, it's 4, and everything is slowed down a bit. The next step up from a 1/3 burst would be a 1/3 stream, which could be any length, but a common one you'll see is 7 notes long because it's just 2 straight beats of 1-3 circles, and it's the same length as a normal 9-note stream in 1-4 rhythm. In simpler maps, these rhythms are sometimes just mapped with repeat sliders so that you still hear the 1-3 beat in your hit sounds, but you don't have to actually tap it. But soon enough, you'll start seeing 1/3 bursts, streams, or sometimes even entire sections of 1/3 streams and jumps. I'd say the most important thing for mastering 1/3s is to really be able to internalize the speed that the song changes to. If we compare the speed of typical 1-4 rhythm with 1-3 rhythm, 1-3 rhythm is at 3/4 the speed, or 75%, which is exactly the same as the halftime mod. So if you want to check the specific BPM of 1/3 patterns, you can just turn on halftime in the main menu and look at the BPM value. At level 18, we have the introduction of 1/6 rhythm, which, as you'd expect, is twice as fast as 1-3 rhythm. By far the most common 1/6 pattern is a 1/6 burst, which is 4 notes long and lasts the same amount of time as a normal triple. Also, since these 1/6 bursts are 4 notes long, they're sometimes also called 1/6 quads. Aside from the speed increase, 1/6 quads are pretty similar in finger control difficulty to regular 1-4 quads, and arguably even easier since they start and stop on white and red ticks without having any of the awkwardness that normal quads have with blue ticks. Lastly, as with 1-3 rhythm, it's important to internalize the speed that the song changes to in 1/6 rhythm. Compared to 1-4 rhythm, 1/6 rhythm is 6/4 the speed, or 150%, which is exactly the same as double time. So, just like before, we can check the speed of a 1/6 burst by just turning on DT and checking the BPM. So most of what we've looked at so far has mostly just been either one pattern in isolation or some simple patterns put together. But now that we've introduced some other types of rhythm, we can start putting them together to create even more complex rhythm and patterns, and this is what the rest of the levels will revolve around. Level 19 brings us the first real combination of rhythms, which is 1/3 mixed in 1/4. Now here I'm not talking about a 1/3 pattern appearing in a map that's mostly 1/4, since that's pretty much how every 1/3 pattern is. I'm talking about a singular pattern that switches between 1/3 and 1/4. Take this pattern, for example. It's a 1/3 stream for 2 beats, then switches immediately into a 1/4 stream for 2 beats. It takes a lot of comfort with 1/3s to be able to switch in and out of them quickly, but as with any other rhythm on this list, as you practice and get more comfortable, it starts to become easier and easier. Level 20 is very similar to level 19, but instead of 1/3 mixed in 1/4, we have 1/6 mixed in 1/4. And this is usually either a 1/6 quad that takes the place of 3 notes in a 1/4 stream, or 8 notes of 1/6 that take the place of 6 notes in a 1/4 stream. This type of pattern is difficult for the same reason as the last level, as it takes a lot of comfort with the different rhythms to be able to switch in and out of them quickly. But since 1/6 is obviously faster than 1/3, I would consider this type of pattern to be considerably harder. Level 21, I would say, is 1/8 triples mixed in 1/4 rhythm. 1/8 doesn't have its own section here since 1/8 on its own is just 1/4 but twice as fast. But if we combine both 1/8 and 1/4, we start to get some new types of patterns. Also, 1/8 rhythms are often represented using repeat sliders in order to avoid the speed and difficulty increase, but higher star maps won't be afraid to throw a 1/8 triple or even burst at you. So this pattern is technically the same as regular 1/4 triples mixed in singletaps but twice as fast, but due to the speed of 1/4 and 1/8 in the majority of maps, you're almost forced to alternate them, which can definitely increase the finger control difficulty, especially if you're someone who has a dominant finger. On top of that, 1/8 tends to feel a bit different rhythm-wise from just basic 1/4 and 1/2, since it's putting emphasis on a beat or tick that usually isn't mapped, so that can slightly increase the difficulty as well. However, the main difficulty here is just the speed aspect coupled with the fact that you're almost forced to alternate it, but if you're someone who always alternates anyway, this type of pattern actually shouldn't be too bad. At level 22, we're starting to see patterns that combine more than two rhythms, and while they aren't super common, they are obviously very tricky. This is 1/3 and 1/6 mixed in a 1/4 pattern, and basically combines the difficulty of levels 19 and 20 and puts them together. I think what's especially tricky about patterns like these is how you have to switch between the slow 1/3 and the fast 1/6 while also throwing 1/4 patterns in the mix. It's hard enough to get comfortable with 1/3s and 1/6s, but putting them both together in the same pattern and then throwing 1/4 on top makes things extremely tricky and is why this pattern is at level 22. Level 23 is 1/6 and 1/8 mixed in 1/4, and at this point it becomes hard to even keep track of how fast all the different notes are in the pattern. It's a reading challenge as much as it is a finger control challenge, and because of the fast speeds of 1/6 and 1/8 patterns, it usually becomes a speed challenge as well. For all those reasons, I would put this type of pattern at level 23. The 24th and final level of this list is 1/8 doubles mixed in 1/4 rhythm. While this doesn't have as many different types of rhythm as the last two levels, the amount of finger control needed for these types of patterns is just so ridiculous, not only because of the constant switching between 1/8 and 1/4, but because the rhythm takes all the rules we learned about making a pattern or rhythm comfortable and just completely throws them out the window. As usual with these higher levels, this type of pattern is really niche, but typically when it shows up, it looks something like this, where the white ticks, which are usually the ticks where the strongest beat in the song are, end up getting skipped, and you have all these fast doubles in weird places, on top of the fact that you're also switching back to 1/4 for some notes, and usually the speed of these patterns is extremely fast. Putting all of that together gets you some of the craziest finger control patterns in the game that only a few players in the world can play properly, which is why it's the highest level on this list. There are other rhythms that I would consider too niche to be given their own category, but if you feel like you've mastered all the finger control patterns in this list, feel free to explore things like 1/5, 1/10, 3/10, and all the other crazy rhythms that are out there. If you've made it this far and want to see more of me, consider subscribing for more content like this one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.